Section 9. The Story of Jees, Part 2, From the Faith of Men. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by M.L. Cohen, Cleveland, Ohio, July 2007. The Story of Jees, Part 2, by Jack London. She came often to the post to trade, and often she sat by the big wood stove and chatted in broken English with Neil Bonner. And he came to look for her coming, and on the day she did not come, he was worried and restless. Sometimes he stopped to think, and then she was met coldly with a resolve that perplexed and piqued her, and which she was convinced was not sincere. But more often he did not dare to think, and then all went well, and there were smiles and laughter. And Amos Pentley, gasping like a stranded catfish, his hollow cough areek with the grave, looked upon it all and grinned. He, who loved life, could not live, and it rankled his soul that others should be able to live. Wherefore he hated Bonner, who was so very much alive, and into whose eyes sprang joy at the sight of Jees. As for Amos, the very thought of the girl was sufficient to send his blood pounding up into a hemorrhage. Jees, whose mind was simple, who thought elementally and was unused to weighing life in its subtler quantities, read Amos Pentley like a book. She warned Bonner, openly and bluntly, in few words, but the complexity of higher existence confused the situation to him, and he laughed at her evident anxiety. To him, Amos was a poor, miserable devil, tottering desperately into the grave. And Bonner, who had suffered much, found it easy to forgive greatly. But one morning, during a bitter snap, he got up from the breakfast table and went into the store. Jees was already there, rosy from the trail, to buy a sack of flour. A few minutes later, he was out in the snow lashing the flour on her sled. As he bent over, he noticed a stiffness in his neck, and felt a premonition of impending physical misfortune. As he put the last half-hitch into the lashing and attempted to straighten up, a quick spasm seized him, and he sank into the snow. Tense and quivering, head jerked back, limbs extended, back arched, and mouth twisted and distorted, he appeared as though being racked limb from limb. Without cry or sound, Jees was in the snow beside him, but he clutched both her wrists spasmodically, and as long as the convulsion endured, she was helpless. In a few minutes the spasm relaxed, and he was left weak and fainting, his forehead beaded with sweat, his lips flecked with foam. "Quick!" he muttered in a strange, hoarse voice. "Quick! Inside!" He started to crawl on his hands and knees, but she raised him up, and supported by her young arm, he made faster progress. As he entered the store, the spasm seized him again, and his body writhed irresistibly away from her and rolled and curled on the floor. Amos Pentley came and looked on with curious eyes. "Oh, Amos!" she cried in an agony of apprehension and helplessness. "Him die, you think?" But Amos shrugged his shoulders and continued to look on. Bonner's body went slack, the tense muscles easing down and an expression of relief coming into his face. "Quick!" he gritted between his teeth, his mouth twisting with the oncoming of the next spasm and with his effort to control it. "Quick, Jees, the medicine! Never mind! Drag me!" She knew where the medicine chest stood, at the rear of the room beyond the stove, and thither by the legs she dragged the struggling man. As the spasm passed, he began, very faint and very sick, to overhaul the chest. He had seen dogs die exhibiting similar symptoms to his own, and he knew what should be done. He held up a vial of chloral hydrate, but his fingers were too weak and nerveless to draw the cork. This Jees did for him, while he was plunged into another convulsion. As he came out of it, he found the open bottle proffered him, and looked into the great black eyes of the woman, and read what men have always read in Mate women's eyes. Taking a full dose of the stuff, he sank back until another spasm had passed. Then he raised himself limply on his elbow. "Listen, Jees," he said very slowly, as though aware of the necessity for haste and yet afraid to hasten. "Do what I say. Stand by my side, but do not touch me. I must be very quiet, but you must not go away." His jaw began to set and his face to quiver and distort with the forerunning pangs, but he gulped and struggled to master them. "Do not go away. And do not let Amos go away. Understand? Amos must stay right here." She nodded her head, and he passed off into the first of many convulsions, which gradually diminished in force and frequency. Jees hung over him, remembering his injunction and not daring to touch him. Once Amos grew restless and made as though to go into the kitchen, but a quick blaze from her eyes quelled him, and after that, save for his labored breathing and charnel cough, he was very quiet. Bonner slept. The blink of light that marked the day disappeared. Amos, followed about by the woman's eyes, lighted the kerosene lamps. Evening came on. Through the north window the heavens were emblazoned with an auroral display, which flamed and flared and died down into blackness. Some time after that, Neil Bonner roused. First he looked to see that Amos was still here, then smiled at Jees and pulled himself up. Every muscle was stiff and sore, and he smiled ruefully, pressing and prodding himself as if to ascertain the extent of the ravage. Then his face went stern and businesslike. "Jees," he said, "take a candle, go into the kitchen. There is food on the table, biscuits and beans and bacon, also coffee in the pot on the stove. Bring it here on the counter. Also bring tumblers and water and whiskey, which you will find on the top shelf of the locker. Do not forget the whiskey." Having swallowed a stiff glass of the whiskey, he went carefully through the medicine chest, now and again putting aside with definite purpose certain bottles and vials. Then he set to work on the food, attempting a crude analysis. He had not been unused to the laboratory in his college days, and was possessed of sufficient imagination to achieve results with his limited materials. The condition of tetanus which had marked his paroxysm simplified matters, and he made but one test. The coffee yielded nothing, nor did the beans. To the biscuits he devoted the utmost care. Amos, who knew nothing of chemistry, looked on with steady curiosity. But Jees, who had boundless faith in the white man's wisdom, and especially in Neil Bonner's wisdom, and who not only knew nothing but knew that she knew nothing, watched his face rather than his hands. Step by step he eliminated possibilities until he came to the final test. He was using a thin medicine vial for a tube, and this he held between him and the light, watching the slow precipitation of a salt through the solution contained in the tube. He said nothing, but saw what he had expected to see. And Jees, her eyes riveted on his face, saw something too, something that made her spring like a tigress upon Amos, and with splendid suppleness and strength bend his body back across her knee. Her knife was out of its sheath and uplifted, glinting in the lamplight. Amos was snarling, but Bonner intervened ere the blade could fall. "That's a good girl, Jees, but never mind. Let him go." She dropped the man obediently, though with protest writ large on her face, and his body thudded to the floor. Bonner nudged him with his moccasined foot. "Get up, Amos," he commanded. "You've got to pack an outfit yet tonight and hit the trail." "You don't mean to say," Amos blurted savagely. "I mean to say that you tried to kill me," Neil went on in a cold, even tone. "I mean to say that you killed Birdsall for all the company believes he killed himself. You used strychnine in my case. God knows what you fixed him. Now I can't hang you. You're too near dead as it is. But 20 Mile is too small for the pair of us, and you've got the mush. It's 200 miles to Holy Cross. You can make it if you're careful not to overexert. I'll give you grub, a sled, and 3 dogs. You'll be as safe as if you were in jail, for you can't get out of the country. And I'll give you one chance. You're almost dead. Very well. I shall send no word to the company until the spring. In the meantime, the thing for you to do is die. Now mush!" "You go to bed," Jees insisted when Amos had churned away into the night towards Holy Cross. "You sick man yet, Neil." "And you're a good girl, Jees," he answered, "and here's my hand on it. But you must go home." "You don't like me?" she said simply. He smiled, helped her on with her parka, and led her to the door. "Only too well, Jees," he said softly. "Only too well." After that, the pall of the Arctic night fell deeper and blacker on the land. Neil Bonner discovered that he had failed to put proper valuation upon even the sullen face of the murderous and death-stricken Amos. It became very lonely at 20 Mile. "For the love of God, Prentice, send me a man," he wrote to the agent at Fort Hamilton, 300 miles upriver. 6 weeks later, the Indian message brought back a reply. It was characteristic. Hell. Both feet frozen. Need 'em myself. Prentice. To make matters worse, most of the Toyaats were in the back country on the flanks of a caribou herd, and Jees was with them. Removing to a distance seemed to bring her closer than ever, and Neil Bonner found himself picturing her, day by day, in camp and on trail. It is not good to be alone. Often he went out of the quiet store, bareheaded and frantic, and shook his fist at the blink of day that came over the southern skyline. And on cold, still nights he left his bed and stumbled into the frost, where he assaulted the silence at the top of his lungs that there was some tangible, sentient thing that he might arouse, or he shouted at the sleeping dogs till they howled and howled again. One shaggy brute he brought into the post, playing that it was the new man set by Prentice. He strove to make it sleep decently under the blankets at night, and to sit at table and eat as a man should. But the beast, mere domesticated wolf that it was, rebelled and sought out dark corners and snarled and bit him in the leg, and finally was beaten and driven forth. Then the trick of personification seized upon Neil Bonner and mastered him. All the forces of his environment metamorphosed into living, breathing entities and came to live with him. He recreated the primitive pantheon, reared an altar to the sun and burned candle fat and bacon grease thereon, and in the unfenced yard by the long-legged cache made a frost devil, which he was wont to make faces at and mock when the mercury oozed down into the bulb. All this in play, of course. He said to himself that it was in play, and repeated it over and over to make sure, unaware that madness is ever prone to express itself in make-believe and play. One midwinter day, Father Champreau, a Jesuit missionary, pulled into 20 Mile. Bonner fell upon him and dragged him into the post and clung to him and wept until the priest wept with him from sheer compassion. Then Bonner became madly hilarious and made lavish entertainment, swearing valiantly that his guest should not depart. But Father Champreau was pressing to salt water on urgent business for his order, and pulled out next morning, with Bonner's blood threatened on his head. And the threat was in a fair way towards realization when the Toyaats returned from their long hunt to the winter camp. They had many furs, and there was much trading and stir at 20 Mile. Also, Jees came to buy beads and scarlet cloths and things, and Bonner began to find himself again. He fought for a week against her. Then the end came one night when she rose to leave. She had not forgotten her repulse, and the pride that drove Spike O'Brien on to complete the Northwest Passage by land was her pride. "I go now," she said. "Good night, Neil." But he came up behind her. "Nay, it is not well," he said. And as she turned her face toward him with a sudden joyful flash, he bent forward slowly and gravely, as it were a sacred thing, and kissed her on the lips. The Toyaats had never taught her the meaning of a kiss upon the lips, but she understood and was glad. With the coming of Jees at once things brightened up. She was regal in her happiness, a source of unending delight. The elemental workings of her mind and her naive little ways made an immense sum of pleasurable surprise to the over-civilized man that had stooped to catch her up. Not alone was she solace to his loneliness, but her primitiveness rejuvenated his jaded mind. It was as though, after long wandering, he had returned to pillow his head in the lap of Mother Earth. In short, in Jees he found the youth of the world, the youth and the strength and the joy. And to fill the full round of his need, and that they might not see overmuch of each other, there arrived at 20 Mile one Sandy McPherson, as companionable a man as ever whistled along the trail or raised a ballad by a campfire. A Jesuit priest had run into his camp a couple of 100 miles up the Yukon, in the nick of time to say a last word over the body of Sandy's partner. And on departing the priest had said, "My son, you will be lonely now." And Sandy had bowed his head brokenly. "At 20 Mile, the priest added, there is a lonely man. You have need of each other, my son." So it was that Sandy became a welcome third at the post, brother to the man and woman that resided there. He took Bonner moose hunting and wolf trapping, and in return, Bonner resurrected a battered and way-worn volume and made him friends with Shakespeare, till Sandy declaimed iambic pentameters to his sled dog whenever they waxed mutinous. And of the long evenings they played cribbage and talked and disagreed about the universe, while Jees rocked matronly in an easy chair and darned their moccasins and socks. Spring came. The sun shot up out of the south. The land exchanged its austere robes for the garb of a smiling wanton. Everywhere light laughed and life invited. The days stretched out their balmy length, and nights passed from blinks of darkness to no darkness at all. The river bared its bosom, and snorting steamboats challenged the wilderness. There were stir and bustle, new faces, and fresh facts. An assistant arrived at 20 miles, and Sandy McPherson wandered off with a bunch of prospectors to invade the Koyukuk country. And there were newspapers and magazines and letters for Neil Bonner. And Jees looked in worriment, for she knew his kindred talked with him across the world. Without much shock, it came to him that his father was dead. There was a sweet letter of forgiveness dictated in his last hours. There were official letters from the company graciously ordering him to turn the post over to the assistant and permitting him to depart at his earliest pleasure. A long legal affair from the lawyers informed him of interminable lists of stocks and bonds, real estates, rents, and chattels that were his by his father's will. And a dainty bit of stationery, sealed and monogrammed, implored Neil's return to his heartbroken and loving mother. Neil Bonner did some swift thinking, and when the Yukon Belle coughed into the bank on her way down to Bering Sea, he departed. Departed with the ancient lie of quick return, young and blithe, on his lips. "I'll come back, dear Jees, before the first snow flies," he promised her, between the last kisses at the gangplank. And not only did he promise, but like the majority of men under the same circumstances, he really meant it. To John Thompson, the new agent, he gave orders for the extension of unlimited credit to his wife, Jees. Also, with his last look from the deck of the Yukon Belle, he saw a dozen men at work rearing the logs that were to make the most comfortable house along 1,000 miles of riverfront, the house of Jees, and likewise the house of Neil Bonner, ere the first flurry of snow. For he fully and fondly meant to come back. Jees was dear to him, and further, a golden future awaited the north. With his father's money, he intended to verify that future. An ambitious dream allured him. With his 4 years of experience, and aided by this friendly cooperation of the P.C. Company, he would return to become the Rhodes of Alaska. And he would return, fast as steam could drive, as soon as he had put into shapes the affairs of his father, whom he had never known, and comforted his mother, whom he had forgotten. There was much ado when Neil Bonner came back from the Arctic. The fires were lighted and the flesh-pots slung, and he took it of all and called it good. Not only was he bronzed and creased, but he was a new man under his skin, with a grip on things and a seriousness and control. His own companions were amazed when he declined to hit up the pace in the good old way, while his father's cronies rubbed their hands gleefully, and became an authority upon the reclamation of wayward and idle youth. For 4 years Neil Bonner's mind had lain fallow. Little that was new had been added to it, but it had undergone a process of selection. It had, so to say, been purged of the trivial and superfluous. He had lived quick years down in the world, and up in the wilds time had been given to him to organize the confused mass of his experiences. His superficial standards had been flung to the winds, and new standards erected on deeper and broader generalizations. Concerning civilization, he had gone away with one set of values, had returned with another set of values. Aided also by the earth smells in his nostrils and the earth sights in his eyes, he laid hold of the inner significance of civilization, beholding with clear vision its futilities and powers. It was a simple little philosophy he evolved. Clean living was the way to grace. Duty performed was sanctification. One must live clean and do his duty in order that he might work. Work was salvation. And to work towards life abundant and more abundant was to be in line with the scheme of things and the will of God. Primarily, he was of the city, and his fresh earth grip and virile conception of humanity gave him a finer sense of civilization and endeared civilization to him. Day by day, the people of the city clung closer to him, and the world loomed more colossal. And, day by day, Alaska grew more remote and less real. And then he met Kitty Sharon, a woman of his own flesh and blood and kind, a woman who put her hand into his hand and drew him to her, till he forgot the day and hour and the time of the year the first snow flies on the Yukon. End of the story of Jees, Part 2.